On this episode of Fireside Bible Stories, we are going to conclude the story of one of the greatest heroes of the Bible, Samson. If you recall from last week, we found out that Samson really isn't a hero of the faith like maybe we learned in Sunday school when we were kids. In fact, Samson's really not much of a believer at all, but at the end of his life, like we're going to see tonight, he has a change of heart that leads him to where he needs to be. It was nearly 100 years after the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. Emperor Hadrian had had enough of these Jewish revolts. 2 years earlier, the emperor had sent his General Sextus Julius Severus into Judea with 6 full legions with auxiliaries, as well as elements of 6 other legions, to completely and finally crush the Jewish people. Jerusalem was completely razed. Just as Jesus had predicted, there was not one stone left on top of the other where the temple once stood. Hadrian had plans to build a temple to Jupiter on the spot, but that wasn't enough. He consulted with the governor, Quintus Tenius Rufus, on how to thoroughly crush the spirit of the Jews as well. Hadrian knew some about the Jewish culture and history. He knew that they called their land Judah because of the great tribe of Judah that had produced the likes of King David, and even this Jesus fellow that they had had to eliminate many years prior. These followers of Jesus of Nazareth were a whole different set of problems for the empire. But these Jews were very proud of their ties to their collective heritage and of their ancient kingdom of Judah. I propose that we rename the region after the Jews' oldest and most hated enemy, Hadrian calmly stated. Do you propose then to make the Idumeans the beneficiaries of Rome's conquest of the Jews? Rufus asked, as respectfully as he could. Idumeans? Why would you think that? Like I said, Hadrian had been well read on Jewish history, but not as well versed in their cultural identity. You see, he viewed the Idumeans as ethnic Jews. In reality, they were Idumeans, or Edomites in the Semitic languages. And they were subject of an ancient Hebrew phrase, Olam Ibah, the everlasting hatred. You see, the Jews were descendants of Isaac's son Jacob, who, by deceit, received Isaac's blessing and inheritance. The Edomites, or the Idumeans, were descendants of Jacob's older twin brother and rightful heir Esau. So Hadrian was right that they were ethnically the same, but biblically speaking, there's no more vile enemy to the Jews than the Edomites. Well, the Idumeans are Jews, responded Hadrian confidently. The Herods were Idumeans. Even one of Jesus of Nazareth's cohorts, Judas, was an Idumean. No, I propose we name the region for the historic mortal enemy of the Jews. We will name the region Palestine. Once again, Hadrian was not technically wrong. The Palestinians had been historically a nation of people that had been Israel's mortal enemies. You may not recognize Palestinians as Old Testament adversaries of Israel, but just like with Edom's name being changed by its Greek pronunciation to Idumea, the Latinized name Palestina is more recognizable in its Semitic form, Philistia. The Philistines had been the enemies of Israel from almost the very instant that they set foot in the land of Canaan. They were a group of seafaring pirates that originated from Greek islands and Due to Israel's unfaithfulness, God had allowed the Philistines to subdue Israel and rule over her. Just like with the Roman rule that Israel would live under nearly 1,000 years later, the people of Israel did not do well living as a conquered people. Samson, the Israelite judge with superhuman strength, hated the Philistines, but he had a thing for their women. Against his parents' advice, he'd married a Philistine woman, but she had immediately betrayed him to her people before the wedding feast had even ended. Samson left the feast in a rage and returned to his father's house. And the assumption among those in attendance at the feast was that the wedding was now void. After a few days of cooling off, however, Samson returned for his wife. But when he arrived to collect, his new or his former father-in-law, however you looked at it, wouldn't let him in to see her. "You left and I didn't think you were coming back. I had to do something, so I gave her to your best man," the Philistine man said. He certainly didn't want any trouble from a guy like Samson. So he did his best to try and pacify him. "Why don't you take her younger sister? She's better looking and she won't cross you like your first wife did." Now, it's unclear whether Samson actually wanted his wife back or not. You see, he had a nasty ornery streak and he hated Philistine rule, so he may have only come back as an excuse to start trouble with Israel's overlords. And when his father-in-law said this to him, he got a crazy gleam in his eye and said with a mischievous grin, "This time when I do mischief to the Philistines, I will be without blame." And with that, he promptly left the house. But Samson didn't return home. He, being a great hunter, trapped 300 foxes, and he proceeded to tie 2 foxes' tails together with a torch between them. He then took his 150 pairs of foxes with torches in tow to the Philistine wheat fields. He lit the torches, and the foxes burned down the entire Philistine crop. In their anger, they went to the home of the woman that was still legally his wife, and they drug her and her father out in the street, and they burned them to death in retaliation. Now, whether out of actual affection for his now dead wife or a simple, pure hatred for the Philistines, Samson swore a solemn oath when he learned of their fate. "If this is what you do, I swear I will not stop until I've taken revenge on you," he said. He then slaughtered the Philistines in a great massacre. After the slaughter was over, he fled to a cleft in the rock in a place called Etam in the province of Judah. The Philistines came there and they occupied Judah, looking for this fugitive that had killed so many of their people. They oppressed Judah. And in their oppression, the men of Judah attempted to coax Samson out. But Samson was unfazed. It finally took the men of the tribe of Judah going and pleading with him, begging him to come out. "Don't you know that the Philistines are rulers over us? Why have you done this to us?" they pleaded. "As they have done to me, I have done to them." The men of Judah continued to plead with him to come with them so that they could turn him in and end this bloody oppression that was taking place in their homeland. Samson finally agreed on the condition that the men of Judah wouldn't just kill him as soon as he came out. He agreed to be taken into custody, so they bound him with 2 new ropes. The significance of these 2 ropes being that they were strong and they had not yet become frayed with use or exposure. The Judahites delivered Samson to the Philistines at a place called Lehi. They met him with shouts and jeers. They had, in a roundabout way, finally caught and subdued the mighty Samson. But the Spirit of the Lord came on him as he entered the Philistine camp. The Bible says that the ropes snapped as easily as if they were flax that had caught fire. That's not a very familiar metaphor to me, but let's suffice it to say that he snapped his bindings as easily as if they had tied him up with wet paper towels. And once he was freed, he picked up a jawbone from a recently dead donkey that fortuitously happened to be laying right at his feet, and he laid waste to the entire Philistine camp. When the carnage was complete, 1,000 Philistines lay dead. Since there's no more exhausting endeavor that one can engage in besides mass genocide, well, maybe soccer, Samson had worked up a thirst. In his first recorded conversation with God, Samson's comments are kind of smug. He says, "You've granted me this great victory by the hand of your servant. Am I now to die of thirst and fall into the hands of these uncircumcised Philistines?" Even in the face of his arrogance, God provided a spring of water from a rock. This should have been a moment that brought Samson into alignment with God's plan and purpose. It should have been. Well, Samson appeared to be a firm believer that the best way to get over the last woman is to get under the next one. Shortly after avenging his wife and his father-in-law, Samson met a new woman, a Philistine woman named Delilah. As soon as the leaders of the Philistines found out about Samson's relationship with Delilah, they came to her. "Coax him and find out what makes his strength so great, so that we may overpower him. And for her trouble, Delilah would be paid 1,100 pieces of silver. A small fortune." Well, the very next night, Delilah went to work, putting her feminine wiles to use on Samson to find out the source of his strength so that he might be overpowered. Samson told her, "If they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried out, then I shall become weak like anyone else." He said this as he drifted off to sleep, and then Delilah got up and sent word to the Philistines, who brought the bowstrings and laid in wait. Delilah bound him and shouted, "Samson, the Philistines are here." Immediately, Samson sprang up and shrugged off the bowstrings like they weren't even there, which is no easy feat. Delilah whined to him, "You've mocked me and lied to me. Tell me the source of your strength." They proceeded to go through this little song and dance for the next few nights. Next, he told her that if he were bound with new ropes that had never been used, he would lose his strength. Then he told her that if the 7 locks of his hair were woven into a womb and bound with a pin, he would weaken. And each time he told Delilah a new story, the Philistines brought her the requisite material and laid in wait outside of her chambers. And each time Delilah tried the next tactic that Samson gave her, she was disappointed to find that he'd lied again. Well, common sense should have told Samson, at this point at least, that Delilah was up to no good. It makes you wonder what skills Delilah was employing to keep Samson coming back. She tearfully asked a 4th time what the secret was to his strength, and this time he caved. He explained the Nazirite vows that he'd taken, and that no razor had ever touched his head. And if his hair were to be cut, he would lose all of his strength. If there's one thing that I can identify with, it's the story of a man whose strength comes from his hair. That night, Delilah knew that he had finally told her the truth. And as Samson slept with his head in her lap, a Philistine man came and cut off his 7 locks of hair. They could see the strength draining from his ropey muscles as he slept. For the fourth night, Delilah shouted that the Philistines had come, and this time Samson struggled to stand, even though he was not bound by anything. He was a little groggy, and he'd not fully realized that the Lord had left him. He staggered out into the midst of the Philistines when he finally realized he was alone, literally and spiritually. The Philistines easily overtook him. And as a way of mocking him, they gouged out his eyes. Then they shackled him in bronze shackles. As they were marching him away, Samson couldn't help but think of how easily he could have snapped these shackles off. These shackles made of a soft metal like bronze. But now he barely had the strength to even lift his arms over his head. The Philistines put him to work pushing a millstone where he was nearly forgotten. Months later, the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to their god Dagon. And in a show of pageantry, they paraded their once great hero of the Israelites out. They said, "Our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hands, the ravager of our country, who has killed so many people. Is now powerless before our God," they boasted. They brought out Samson and placed him in chains on a platform where all who were in attendance could see. He feebly asked one of the guards to guide him over to the pillars of this palatial temple structure so that he could lean because he was too weak to stand. There were approximately 3,000 Philistines that were there jeering as Samson was forced to perform for them. Like I said, Samson had been all but forgotten until now. He'd been put to work pushing the millstone, and they just plain forgot about him. The Philistines had also forgotten what it was that had sapped his strength. In their disregard for him, Samson's hair had started to grow back. And as he was leaning on the pillar in the temple of Dagon, he spoke to God, this time in a much more earnest tone than when he needed a drink so many years before. And he cried out, "Lord God, remember me, and strengthen me only this once, O God, so that with this one act of revenge I may pay back the Philistines for my 2 eyes." And with that, Samson began to push. He pushed against the 2 central pillars of the structure. And the people that were in attendance laughed and jeered, but then there was a crack. The laughter quickly turned to gasps. Could it be? Samson continued to push and struggle. It seemed like his muscles were enlarging right before their eyes, and now the Philistines panicked. The pillars were moving. All at once, the people began screaming and stampeding towards the exits, but it was too late. Samson was brought out to perform for the Philistines, and he brought down the house, killing thousands, including himself. It's said that he killed more Philistines in his one act at his death than he had in the entirety of his life. After the dust settled, word reached Israel that God had strengthened Samson one last time, and that he destroyed the temple of Dagon at the cost of his own life. His family came and collected his remains and buried him with his fathers. Samson judged Israel for 20 years. After Samson, there would only be 2 more great judges in Israel, Eli and Samuel. And during Samuel's supervision, the people of Israel would make a decision that they would live to regret. They would cry out for a king. Sometimes the worst possible thing that you can get is exactly what you've asked for.